So each week at about this time, Monday morning or so, I do a weekly recap. And it's gotten out of hand. So I'm trying a new format. The new format is that I'm going to tell you here's the story that was the big story on that day. And here are stories or a story that you probably missed. And you have to prioritize when you're kind of bringing these news stories forward, and so sometimes things just don't get through. So what I used to do was I tried to cover everything in my weekly recap, and that was just getting unwieldy because I have maybe a dozen articles each day that I had isolated and wanted to go through, and I could really only pare it down to about the top three. But okay, so I think this is going to work out for you. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Do you like this format? If you do, I'll keep doing it in the future. Okay, so we'll go back as far as Sunday, December 10th. And on Sunday, December 10th, the story that day was that Zelensky was heading to Argentina, hoping to win support for the Global South. Now, that was good because he was mixing with Global South leaders, and it was kind of a counterbalance for what Russia was doing in Africa. And mixing with Latin America, trying to win some support. And that was famously confronting Orban there. This was at the inauguration of the head of Argentina. That's why he was there. That was the big story. The story that you probably didn't hear much about was how Sergei Lavrov was claiming that Russia is stronger because of the Ukraine war. And he said that the West's 500-year domination of the world was coming to an end. So that's the way that Russia was starting to frame what was happening in the war in Ukraine. It was really Russia breaking free from European domination. Okay, on Monday, 11 December, the big story on this day was that Zelensky was now in Washington and he was going to be urging Congress, and he was talking to the Defense University, not to play into Putin's hands. And so he was in Washington. Nothing else was really that important comparatively to that particular story. But the story that you probably missed was J.D. Vance saying that nobody believes that Ukraine can restore the 1991 border. Now, J.D. Vance is a Republican senator from Ohio. He's very Trumpian. He is it's almost like he's trying to take his place next to Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz as far as one of the loudest vocal critics of Ukraine. Okay, Tuesday, December 12th, the big story, well, there were two. In Ukraine, Ukraine's top mobile operator was hit by the cyber attack, and we were following that, while at the same time, Zelensky was making his 11th hour plea for the Ukraine war funds in Washington. And he was making the rounds between President Biden and the Speaker of the House, and we saw all that on Tuesday. But the story that you probably missed was that in Pravda, they were talking about how Ukraine is part of Russia, the only guarantee that excludes civil war forever. Okay, what Pravda and RT and others are doing now are they're trying to talk about this, frame the war between Russia and Ukraine as a civil war, that is a war within a country, as opposed to that Russia rolled over Ukraine's sovereign borders. It's a big change, and I think that's a narrative that we're going to see more of in the future, denying that Ukraine is its own place, it is part of Russia, and they don't know what they're doing over there in Ukraine, trying to act like this. Okay, Wednesday, December 13th. The big story was that Zelensky stopped in Norway. He's on his way back from the U.S. and still the trip to the U.S. is still reverberating, right? That's what's really in the media. But the story that you probably missed, unless you were watching me, was that Zelensky tells Speaker Johnson. Now, this was on Fox News the night before, where I saw this first, and then so he told Speaker Johnson when he met with Speaker Johnson that Ukraine won't run. This was Zelensky's words on Fox News as Zelensky was being interviewed, that Ukraine won't run out of aid until February. Okay, so whether it's December or January or February, that doesn't matter. What matters is the morality. That's what he said in his interview with Bret Baier. Now that's important because they're not going to run out of runway right away, and you can actually sleep at night knowing that, okay, the political process can work out and they can actually be okay. So knowing that reframes the way that you see what's happened. Okay. Thursday, December 14th. The big story was that the EU agreed to open membership negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova. Now, part of the big story was how that happened. So Viktor Orban was saying, no way, we're not going to do this. This shouldn't happen. They're not ready. They haven't met conditions, so on and so forth. And then Orban gets this big money package that just happened to be about the same time. And the EU leadership said, this is in no way related to what's going on in Ukraine. And then when the vote was about to come, Schultz convinces Orban to go get a cup of coffee, and Orban says he will willingly stepped out of the room knowing what would happen because he tried for 8 hours to convince them otherwise and they weren't going to listen to him, so he left the room. And they voted to open membership talks to Ukraine. Okay, so that was the big story. The story that you probably missed was that Vladimir Putin's war in Russia or in Ukraine had, well, war in Russia. It's a Freudian slip because it is a war on Russia. Putin's war in Ukraine has cost the Russian economy 5% growth, according to the US Treasury. This was carried in Fortune magazine. Let alone the people, the 300,000 casualties, and let alone the destruction, and let alone the inflation and whatever. It's cost 5% in growth, and that's huge. We're talking billions of dollars. Okay. Um, all right, that's the big story for Thursday, or the side story for Thursday. The big story on Friday is that after Orban did what he did by allowing Ukraine to enter into these open negotiations with the EU, uh, Hungary then goes around and blocks $50 billion worth of EU funding for Ukraine. So he allowed the big hurdle, but this smaller hurdle he blocked. That was the big story, and everybody was talking about it. On the same day, the World Bank allocated 1.34 billion in additional financing for Ukraine. Now, some of that was loan, some of that was grant, mostly loan, but still, that was subsumed by all that was going on with Orban and the negotiations for the 50 billion from the EU, which they can get around that. That's not a problem. They can work through individual countries. Okay, Saturday, the big story was that Putin's exaggerating the numbers of Russian troops in Ukraine, according to intelligence reports. He was saying something in an interview about 617,000 troops in Ukraine when it's really something in the order of 450,000 or something like that. But the story that didn't get out was that a third Ukrainian trucker died on the Polish border because of the blockades that were supposed to be lifted earlier in the week but are still there. Sunday, December 17th, that's yesterday, the big story was that while the U.S. House had gone home, the Senate was still working, and Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, said we're probably close to a deal. Um, Lindsey Graham was saying they're not anywhere near close to a deal. That's the big story of what was going on. The story that you probably didn't hear was Putin talking about how he was naive about the West. And if you go back and talk to his younger self, he would say, "Self, the West, just can't trust them." And his understanding of the West is they still think we're the Soviet Union. They don't understand that we have changed. Well, they have changed in not being Marxist Leninists, but they haven't changed in the authoritarianism that in fact, they're re-authoritarianizing, if I can coin that term. Okay, tell me what you think about this format. Do you like the big story and story you missed kind of format? Does that help you understand some context? Because that's my whole goal, is providing you context in the war in Ukraine. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the comments that you tell me what's going on, the feedback here. Do you like this or not? Thank you for the coffees. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.